What, are you waiting for the show to start? Welcome to Dragons and Astronauts. This is a weekly deep dive into the world of young adult science fiction and fantasy, and definitely not that. I am your host, Sarah Cerrone. I am an avid writer and reader, and I wanted to create a channel to explore the worlds of young adult science fiction fantasy. We're going to be approaching the history of these two genres from a business and academic lens with plenty of literary theory. So I want to figure out why some publishing trends work and others don't, What makes some young adult stories resonate really well with an audience and have really fun trends, and what makes others suck or feel tried or just don't quite click with audiences. What was the big deal with love triangles, teenage tournaments to the death, chosen girls who aren't like other girls? And I hope you'll join me. In this series, we're going to cover gems like The Hunger Games, Harry Potter, Divergent, the Cinder series, and many more. So strap in. This is an introduction episode, and so today we are talking about what fantasy, what's sci-fi, and what's YA. So to start, we'll discuss what fantasy is. Fantasy is a genre of literature where the events in the story do not take place in a world like our own. And they normally include supernatural or magical elements. So think magic system, different races, different setting, your orcs, your ogres, your gingerbread man, your talking donkeys. Am I just describing Shrek? Anyway, fantasy also features many common themes. These are good versus evil, a quest for power or knowledge or a thing like a sword or a magical rock or a magical stick or something, an epic journey, the reluctant hero, or even man versus nature, man versus himself, man versus society. Most people think of fantasy, they think Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. And those are really good examples of fantasy, but they kind of encompass only one type of fantasy, which is high fantasy or epic fantasy. Epic fantasy normally involves a magical environment that has its own rules or physical laws, and typically involves a grand scale with great bands of heroes. These worlds usually have that really convoluted magical system and a lot of political intrigue, and the fairy race doesn't like the ogre race, and they fight and then they fall in love. And the opposite of high fantasy is low fantasy. These books normally are set in the real world, but include some sort of magical element. Think, for example, Any Way the Wind Blows by Rainbow Rowell. Low fantasy shares some similarities to another subgenre of fantasy called magical realism. And in magical realism, characters accept fantastical elements as part of everyday life, like reading minds, flying, telekinesis. An example would be The Spellbook of the Lost and Found by Maria Fowle. Fantasy shares some elements with this magical realism, low fantasy. But like the name implies, they're normally set in a very popular urban setting, such as New York City or Paris or even London. A very popular example would be the Shadowhunter series by Cassandra Clare. Now, there's a couple other types of subgenres of fantasy as well. There's dark fantasy that ties fantasy elements with horror elements, fables and fairy tales such as Brothers Grimm, and even superhero fiction to an extent, because if you have magic, which explains your hero getting powers, it could technically be fantasy. So Marvel kind of bridges that line. All right, now, number 2, what's sci-fi? So at this point you're asking, hey, well, if fantasy is just stories that don't exist in the real world, then what's the big difference between fantasy and sci-fi? Well, science fiction features technology or techie scenarios that could become plausible in the future, which develops elements in the story. While fantasy might be magic, rules, explain world, sci-fi is more belief science because world. Science fiction typically explores time travel, space exploration, consequences of all this science, meandering, interplanetary war, alternative history, robots, AI, and spaceships. There's a couple different types of science fiction. There is hard science fiction, which is based off of scientific fact, such as physics, chemistry, and astronomy. A great example would be The Martian by Andy Weir, where the protagonist has to use real-world science to survive off of poop potatoes in space. There is also soft science fiction, where the science might be a little smudged, or it's based off of a soft science like psychology or sociology. Once again, we can get back to the Marvel movies here with like the loop-de-loop of time travel. It's like smidge science. Besides these two general distinctions, there's a couple more subgenres of science fiction. These include supernatural science fiction, where there's a supernatural element with the science, you know, like Frankenstein. There's utopian science fiction, where everything works out. And there's much more commonly dystopian science fiction, where everything does not work out. In fact, it turns out very, 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 very bad, like the Divergent movies. There is also space westerns, which includes elements of the western genres with space, cowboys in space, space western, cyberpunk and steampunk, as well as space opera. Space opera are sci-fi stories that take place in outer space and have plenty of romance, conflict, and adventure to go around. Star Wars would be an awesome example, or even Battlestar Galactica. Okay, so we now know what fantasy is, and we now know what sci-fi is. So what exactly makes a book young adult? So to start, what is young adulthood? Young adulthood is understood as the period of adolescence between your middle school years of about 12 to 13 to 18, characterized by going through puberty, growing emotional maturity, hopefully, and the growing desire to get away from adult authority. Literary scholars Sarah Hertz and Donald Gallo named several criteria for a book to be considered part of young adult literature. And those are: the main character is a teenager who is central to the plot. His or her actions impact the plot. The dialogue reflects their speech. And finally, the point of view is that of an adolescent and reflects the adolescent's interpretation of events and people. So there we go. YA needs a teenage protagonist who says teenage things, who does teenager actions. So if we want to create a YA fantasy here now, we need a fantasy world. We need a teenager, like a 16-year-old girl. We plop the 16-year-old in there and we tell her not to be like other girls. Or if we want to create a YA sci-fi, we have a sci-fi world. We plop in a 17-year-old boy with a bunch of robots and we tell him to go solve an intergalactic conflict or something. Like vice versa, argue in the comments, I don't care. All right, so this episode we learned what YA, what fantasy, and what sci-fi. So we are all set to go. Next episode, we will be discussing the historical rise of what exactly teenagers are. So tell me in the comments, what is your favorite subgenre of fantasy and sci-fi, and what is your least favorite? I'll start. For fantasy, I really love high fantasy or epic fantasy. I hate magical realism because I was like, it's like the saltine cracker of books, right? I would rather just have everybody have magical powers than just one person. For sci-fi, favorite, space opera. Least favorite, God, probably all like the really hard science stuff, because like I am running a book YouTube channel. How do you think I did in high school chemistry? Anyway, please leave a comment. Let me know what your favorite subgenres are. If you have any book suggestions you want to discuss on this channel in those subgenres in the future, please leave me a comment, give me a suggestion, thumbs up, whatever. That's awesome. Next week, we will be discussing what teenagers are, because imagine this, adolescence wasn't really a thing until recently, and therefore there weren't books for adolescents until recently. So please hit the notification bell, subscribe if you're interested. Also, I have a podcast, same name, Dragons and Astronauts, available on Sci-fi. What's Sci-fi? Where are podcasts on Sci-fi? It's not even that's a channel, right? Like a TV. On Spotify, Apple, and wherever else podcasts can be found. I also have my Instagram linked below if you want to see what resources I will be discussing in this series. I have a website also in the show notes where you can go figure out where those things are. So if you're a student and you have a paper due in the future, I don't know, do what you need to do, College is crazy. High school is crazy. School is crazy. Maybe you're getting your master's. I don't know. Good for you, though. Anyway, until next time, happy reading. Why are you still here?